Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Hello and welcome to Living on the Edge. In this week's program, Eco-Refugees, the profile of a community that runs into millions, a look at what the absence of toilet facilities for a vast majority of our people means, and a report on the abysmal conditions prevailing in our zoos. Newspapers and television are full of reports on people who've had to leave their homes to escape strife and persecution. But there's also a large number who are forced to migrate because their lands don't sustain them anymore. They're called eco-refugees, their numbers run into millions, and they have no one to turn to. Priya Somaya reports.
They were all asked what human security meant to them.
A man from Kyrgyzstan said, "Human security indicates faith in tomorrow. When there is a stable political and economic situation, then there is security."
A woman from Nigeria said, "My security is in the name of the Lord who has made heaven and earth. I feel secure when I'm at liberty to worship whom I like, how I like."
If security is the foundation on which people want to build their lives, they have plenty to be worried about. Ethnic strife, economic instability, and repressive governments are forcing millions of people to flee their countries in search of peace and to rebuild their shattered lives. Whether it's Rwanda, Angola, or Bosnia, it's clear that conflict is creating more refugees than anyone would care to count. But it's not just conflict that's causing people to flee. In addition to the various types of refugees classified by the UN, a new category may soon be added, that of the environment or eco-refugee, one who's displaced by big dam projects, declining soil fertility, or other environment changes that make his lifestyle unsustainable.
In simple terms, they live on their environment. They get their food from their environment. They get their fodder. They get their water from the environment. They get medicinal herbs from the environment. They literally subsist on the environment. Now, if the environment degrades, they have no other choice but to leave.
And today, that number runs into millions, with many of them in third world countries. In India, for example, big dams, commercial mines, and thermal plants are causing severe environmental problems and displacing millions from traditional occupations. With their lifestyle destroyed and livelihood gone, their survival hangs in balance. For Dinanath, the Garhwal Hills have been home since he was a child. He inherited land and cattle and would have been happy to live and die here. But that was not to be. He was suddenly told that he would have to give up his land and leave to make way for the Tehri Dam. He's been given land in the plains and a new lifestyle to adjust to. He's worried he may be evicted again because his land lies within the Rajaji Park, which is protected. As he sees it, things can only get worse. His plight is shared by lakhs, possibly millions.
It's estimated that out of something like 25 million people who've been displaced out of mega projects, only 5 million people have been rehabilitated. So what happens to the rest of those 20 million people?
But there is another hidden process at work that is forcing people to leave their homes, and that is the gradual depletion of natural resources. It could be the drying up of underground water systems and the ingress of saline water leaving villages in Gujarat parched. Or it could be soil erosion leading to desertification in Rajasthan that forces people to abandon their land. When forests gradually disappear and grazing lands are swallowed up by commercial activity, people are forced to move to other areas and look for alternate employment. Whichever way one looks at it, displacement is inevitable.
And that, I think, is very much a process. It's not an event. It's not something that hits the headlines of newspapers. When there's a drought, there's prostitution, and that all newspapers carry. Okay? When there is a large project, there is displacement. Again, it's something which appears in government figures. But I think what we do not at all understand is the processes which lead people to leave their homes.
Take for instance fishing communities whose existence depends on their everyday catch. With huge companies extending trawler operations, local fisherfolk are being squeezed out in many areas.
For the poor, environment is economics. And so if you look at it, people leave their homes because they are not doing it just because they're looking for more money in the cities, but because they are forced to do so. They're driven out. And they're driven out often because of lack of water, because their streams have died, their rivers have become polluted, the forests have disappeared.
Unfortunately, man doesn't seem to have learnt any lessons from history. When several large-scale migrations were induced by ecological changes, cultures disappeared altogether. Independent analysts, however, argue that present-day changes are very different from the ones that occurred in ancient times.
These changes were caused by geological and climatic factors. Once we are talking about the present, we are talking about a different kind of a change which are caused by human intervention.
Besides, ancient cultures had built-in mechanisms by which nature's gifts were used more carefully. Some of this is evident in tribal cultures even today.
Religious restrictions, certain kinds of rituals and practices often restricted and limited overuse of natural resources. For instance, rivers were considered mother goddesses, sacred groves were protected, sacred ponds were protected, the killing of totemic animals were restricted, a whole range of practices which in a certain way regulated the use of resources. This kind of value system and the religious restrictions tends to break down with the penetration of commerce.
Today, overpopulation and excessive commercial exploitation is nibbling away at precious resources. We could well lose the bulk of our forests within half a lifespan. The loss of arable land is already adding about 20 million to the list of landless laborers every year. Water pollution could lead to severe water shortages in the next decade. This means that the number of environmental refugees is only going to grow. The number of occupations they can turn to in alien surroundings doesn't fill anyone with optimism. Though the cities remain likely destinations for those seeking livelihood, not everyone goes there. Some move and settle in other forest areas. Inevitably, these precious forests are gradually destroyed. Can our country, burdened by a huge population, really afford the environmental cost of millions of forced migrations every year? Sadly, the government doesn't seem to acknowledge, let alone plan action measures to reverse this trend. Most plans ignore environmental degradation as a cause for migration and tend to focus on economic compulsions.
The government hasn't been able to work out a rehabilitation and resettlement package even for big mega dam ousties. So the question of any kind of governmental action on something which is not even recognized as yet in this country, I don't see that happening.
It's obvious that the problem of environmental refugees can't be ignored indefinitely. Already, migrants have started spilling over international boundaries because their lives were no longer sustainable. Nepali and Bangladeshi settlers are a case in point. Even the UNHCR, which doesn't directly acknowledge the plight of environmental refugees, concedes that political and ethnic strife is aggravated by ecological problems.
There are situations, and there have been situations in the past, where groups of people, and large groups of people, have left their countries. Some of them, as in Africa, you recall in Ethiopia in the mid-80s, there was a very big famine. But that movement was combined with the fact that there were disturbances, internal conflicts that were going on. So people were moving for both reasons of insecurity in the country and reasons of very serious difficulties faced due to climatic reasons.
There are some indicators that are like in a patient, signs of warning. If you look at the number of disasters in our world, you'll see that there is an exponential increase. In 1960, I noted down, there were 16 major disasters. In 1970s, there were 29. In 1980, there were 70. Now, there is that increase, which is not accidental.
And one of the reasons for this is that our environment is more fragile today than it has ever been. The large-scale migrations of people leaving their homes and hearth is only a symptom of this. And unless the incessant pressure on land and scarce resources eases, the desperation and misery of this man will continue to be reflected in the faces of millions.
That was Priya Somaya on the plight of eco-refugees. Our next story is prompted in a sense by a viewer letter. I'm a regular viewer of Living on the Edge. I want to bring to your notice the miserable and shameful condition of scavengers in Kolar goldfields. The most inhuman and degrading practice of manual carrying and clearing of human excreta is still prevalent in KGF in Kolar district, which is a mere 100 kilometers from the capital of Karnataka, Bangalore. I request your team to visit KGF, film the humiliating manner in which the Dalits earn their bread, and do something within your reach to help them. If not anything, at least bring it to the notice of the state and central governments and push them to abolish this shameful and inhuman practice. Hope you pay heed to my earnest request. I'm afraid we can't visit Kolar just yet. Instead, here's a report by Priya Somaya on what the absence of toilet facilities means for millions of our countrymen and how this absence helps perpetuate the evils of scavenging.
जी ऐसा था शाम के 8:30 बज रहे थे मैं जमुना में लैट्रिन करने गई लड़के बैठे शराब पी रहे थे बहुत लड़के थे शराब पी रहे थे मेरे सहारे से बगैर सहारे थे मैंने सोचा रात में इतनी कहाँ चली है रात में कहाँ जा रही है इसको ये तो पता नहीं लैट्रिन में जा रही तो एक गुंडे मतलब पीछे इज्जत पे हमला करने के लिए दौड़े गए बस में नहीं आए तो उसने तेल डाल के आग लगा दी
Santosh's shocking experience is not unique. Women like her, forced outdoors to relieve themselves, are often victims of molestation and rape. The darkness, which should be ideal for women seeking privacy, actually makes them vulnerable to horrifying encounters that fill them with dread.
औरत टट्टी गया था तो उसको 2 लौंडा पकड़ाया पकड़ाने बाद वो तो पुलिस बेइज्जती कर लिया उसको उसके बाद मैंने पुलिस के पास गया पुलिस खुद ही उसको बेइज्जती कर दिया करने के बाद उसके तेजाब डाल दिया बदन में अच्छा ऐसे ज़्यादा केस होता है क्या ज़्यादा केस होता है ऐसे एक लौंडिया कोमरी लौंडिया उसको भी मैंने चाकू मार दिया था बदन में चिढ़ाता है लोग बट जाए कोई लोग आवाज़ देता है कभी दिन में जाने तो बहुत डर लगता है
Although women and girls are the most affected by the lack of toilets, men are inconvenienced too. After all, would anyone who had a choice prefer wide open spaces? What makes this worse is that hundreds of millions of citizens across the country share a similar plight. Of an estimated 900 million, only about 200 million enjoy proper sanitation. This means that 700 million people defecate in the open. The implications of this particularly in urban tenements and slums, are obvious. Disease is rampant and illnesses spread rapidly, acquiring epidemic-like proportions. And yet, when you come to think of it, this is a reality most of us have come to accept. What usually escapes us is the social implication of the lack of access to sanitation for millions of citizens. This fact is at the root of tension in many areas.
In January this year, police fired and killed 4 of a violent crowd protesting defecating rights in Delhi. In December 94, a man was arrested by the Bombay police for trespassing in a private building. He was looking for a toilet. Numerous cases of molestation and rape of women while they were defecating out in the open have been reported, and all because they didn't have the privacy of a toilet.
Yet another fallout of the growing crisis surrounding defecation rights, if you choose to call it that, is the perpetuation of the age-old and inhuman practice of scavenging. As long as public toilets remain a dream, the plight of night soil carriers can only worsen. Mohini works in a slum in Patna. Every morning she visits at least 30 households to collect night soil the way her forefathers did.
हम गंदा काम करते हैं और फिर से उठाते हैं, सिर पर लेते हैं और फिर आगे गिराते जाए, चलते जाए।
छुआछूत लोग करते हैं क्या?
करता है, दूर रहता है, कमाते तो दूर चल जाता है, हट जाता है और क्या करता है?
Treated as virtual untouchables, there are over 6 lakh people trapped in the system.
पहले झाड़ू पर डाला, मीठापुर, वहाँ से बदल के टाटी पर डाला, टाटी पर से बदल के फिर झाड़ुए पर डाला, कोई ना पूछता।
As long as toilets are elusive, the hope that things can get better for scavengers is a remote dream. Today, only 200 out of a total of over 2,000 towns have sewage systems which conventional toilets require. City municipalities are unable to plan for existing numbers as they are ever increasing. पर यहाँ बस्ती में ये बस्ती तो 10 साल से
ज़्यादा है। इस बस्ती में नहीं है।
क्यों
ये
नहीं
बात ठीक है, इस पर विचार कर लेंगे।
नहीं क्यों
कुछ
नहीं
और
है?
बनाया जा सकता है या नहीं?
कितने यहाँ होंगे? आपको मालूम होगा यहाँ कितने बाथरूम हैं?
यहाँ पर 3 हैं।
3 ही बाथरूम है और आबादी कितनी है यहाँ?
आबादी है तो उसको सारे दिन यूज किए जाते हैं।
कितने आबादी है?
आबादी करीब 20,000 है।
आपके हिसाब से ये ठीक है कि 3 बाथरूम है और
मैंने आपको भी बताया कि हम और बनाने जा रहे हैं, उन पर काम चल रहा है।
For squatter settlement for provision of pay and use Jan Suvidha complexes, around ₹20 crores has been spent. And it is expected that in 95-96, we may make an investment of another ₹20 crores.
Living on the Edge found that 20 crores for 8,000 seats works out to 1/4 of a lakh per seat, which sounds ridiculously high given cheaper environment-friendly alternatives that exist. Besides, the authorities rarely include maintenance costs in their projections, which are vital for hygiene. Don't you feel sometimes there must be some kind of corruption or...
These are the hard realities of life.
First priority is given, say, to roads, water facility, electricity. Toilet facility is almost at the end of the priorities list.
Given the low priority accorded to toilets and their focal position in everyday lives of people, the search for alternatives to capital-intensive sewage facilities continues. Organizations like Sulabh have evolved designs that don't require expensive sewage systems. Cost-effective toilets like this one can be constructed with collection pits, which could not only provide toilet facilities for large numbers, but also free scavengers from their demeaning work. Innovative designs have also been evolved where waste collected could be used to generate electricity. But unless sincere steps are taken to provide this basic need, resentment and desperation will only grow. अच्छा, ये जो सारी सुविधा है, पानी का, ये इलेक्ट्रिसिटी का, मकान का और ये जो लैट्रिन का, उसमें से आप क्या सोचते हैं सबसे महत्व कौन सा है?
लैट्रिन।
क्यों?
उसका इसलिए है अगर वो एक पर्दा हुआ, पर्दे के अंदर पहुँचेंगे कोई उसकी इज्जत का हमला नहीं कर सकता।
नेता लोग क्या वोट के लिए आता है और वोट लेके चला जाता, बात कहता है बना दूंगा, मगर वोट लेने का बाद ठहंगा दिखा के चला जाता है इन लोग, मालूम है। और लेटरिन इतनी गंदगी के अंदर जाना पड़ता है, इसमें ये मक्खी मच्छर, और जहाँ पे औरत लेटरिन करती है जहाँ पे मर्द करता है इसमें कुछ इज्जत बात नहीं, हमारी यही बेइज्जती है बस।
A clean toilet with running water and privacy is a luxury most of us take for granted. It's only when our planners recognize that it's as important as food and water that we will begin to address the problem. Before we go on to our next story, here's a letter from Mayank Rawat of Karnal, Haryana. I recently visited a circus in our town. I was shocked to see the treatment given to animals who were put in small cages and they were being whipped even on stage. I've decided not to go to circuses anymore. I would be glad if you did a story on this issue. After all, animals are a part of the environment. Mayank, thanks for a very good story idea, and we'll do it as soon as possible. Till then, here's a report by Shonad Joshi on the plight of animals living in zoos. It's depressing, and I hope you won't stop visiting zoos as a result.
The natural environment is disappearing. The population is rising. The forests are declining. Now, you have two choices. Number one, you let them die wherever they are, or you try to find alternative havens for them.
This particular zoo attracts about 3,000 visitors every day. Rather than delighting in the company of rare species, many visitors spend their time teasing animals. This may seem a sign of heightened interest to some, but there's no doubt that it puts animals already in an alien environment under extreme stress.
आपको भड़काना अच्छा लगता है?
अच्छा तो लगता है भड़काने, अब बैठने के बाद उसको तो मज़ा नहीं आता देखने में, और वो छेड़ने में थोड़ा और मज़ा आता है।
Sadly, very few visitors are interested in the history of an animal, its peculiar characteristics, and the fact that it might not be happy in closed spaces.
हमको अभी तो कुछ इसके बारे में मालूम नहीं है, देखने के लिए अधिक आते हैं, जानने के लिए इतना नहीं।
That's a pity, for the zoo does have an education department which only a few use. If more people did, they would realize that throwing polythene bags into enclosures can be potentially harmful to animals. In fact, many of the problems that arise hinge on the way we use our zoos. For a wild animal, a greater part of the day is spent hunting for food. Here he receives his meals at regular intervals and lives a monotonous life. The water hole of the wild is replaced by moats full of stagnant water, a breeding ground for bacteria that give the animals various diseases like gastroenteritis with fatal consequences. Those who don't have the luxury of a water hole are given cement bowls in their cages, which are invariably empty. Many unfortunate animals spend their time close to the empty bowls, waiting for water to quench their thirst. In outdoor enclosures, foliage is scarce. This makes the animal feel exposed and it begins to pace up and down nervously. Some animals do have coolers installed in their quarters to give them relief from the searing heat. But here, the size of the cages are the problem. Not much larger than the animal, and tiled, the cages reduce the majestic tiger and intelligent chimpanzee to pitiful prisoners. Even the athletic kangaroo that travels in leaps and bounds feels that he cannot move more than a few feet. Not surprisingly, behavioral changes are known to take place, further exacerbating the animal's condition. Officials argue that enclosures are made to resemble the natural habitat of the animal, but the fact is that all these animals spend a better part of their day and night in their inner cages. Perhaps the strongest criticism levelled at the zoo is that it is managed by people who are not specifically trained for the purpose.
That a keeper who is a sincere worker is laughed upon by his colleagues. They humiliate him that you are trying to flatter or your bosses. So today they feel very hesitant to work because the entire atmosphere is not congenial to work.
Does that explain why the Delhi Zoo has not had a full-time veterinary doctor for the last 8 years? In this zoo, it is an assistant veterinary officer who fills the need. Of the many exotic and endangered species that visit the hospital, there are some that don't survive. And when the animals do succumb, this is where they are buried, in half-filled graves, a depressing testimony to our inability to do anything right. This is where the chain of neglect, beginning by inadequate protection, poor food and water conditions, ends. Even in death, the animal isn't assured of a decent burial.
They'll just die, and finally it would be man who would suffer. We must educate people, and we must tell them that this is a national heritage.
To the general public, regular meals and attention may seem ideal for animals. But in reality, they become sluggish, nervous, less alert and suffer from intense boredom. It is only when our zoos cater to each animal's individual characteristics and habitat and make search for food into a game, as zoos around the world are doing, that we will be able to make zoos what they should be: secure havens for animals that are disappearing in the wild and one of the best centers of conservation.
On that depressing note, it's time to wrap up this week's program. But before we end, it's time for one more letter from Sarika Tukral of Karnal, Haryana. I wish to share a handy hint with all the viewers of this program. Reuse envelopes by doing your rough work on it. Make your shopping list on old greeting cards and pamphlets. The reverse side of computer printouts cut into a smaller size makes an ideal jotting pad. Though these are small things, they count a lot. Adopt this practice and the rest of the family is sure to follow suit. Thanking you in anticipation and wishing you good luck for presenting such a nice program. Thank you, Sarika. I can only hope that our viewers will follow your lead.
70% of all available water in India is polluted.